Miki mamusia zmarła, to on doszedł do mnie, mamusia, ja już nie mam mojej mamusi więcej. To po 3 dniach mu powiedziałam, teraz ja jestem twoją mamusią. Każdej matce życzę takiego syna jak ja mam. Te wieczór między 5 i 6 jest telefon z niego. To on mówi, Shalom mamusia, ja cię kocham.
We just heard from Gertruda Babilińska describe the moment that she went from being the nanny of Michael Stołowicki, whom she affectionately called Miki, to becoming his adoptive mother. Michael was a young Polish-Jewish boy whom Gertruda hid and rescued from the Nazis. Hello, I'm historian Edna Friedberg. Today, we'll learn about the promises and incredible sacrifices that Gertruda made to save Michael's life and raise him as her own. I'm really pleased to be joined by my friend and colleague, Kyra Schuster, a curator for the museum. Welcome back, Kyra.
Thank you, Edna. Thanks for having me.
Viewers, please send your questions for Kyra and we'll get to them if we can during the live program. So let's begin by getting to know this woman. Who was Gertruda Babilińska?
Gertruda was born into a devout Catholic family, and she was the oldest of 8 children. The family lived in Starograd, Poland. And even though her family had little money, Gertruda really received an excellent education, which did include learning German. She worked as a teacher in her hometown until she moved to Warsaw in order to look for additional and new job opportunities.
And there in the capital city, Gertruda was hired by the Stovitz family. Please introduce us, tell us a little about this family and what led them to so deeply appreciate and care about Gertruda.
Jacob Stołowicki was a very wealthy man who inherited his family's successful business, which was supplying steel for railroads. He and his wife Lydia lived with their young son Michael, who was born in 1936. The family lived in Warsaw. They were very well-connected members of society, often entertaining members of the Polish elite and famous guests and artists from abroad. Now, Lydia was in poor health when they hired Gertruda, and Lydia was very impressed with Gertruda's strong education, her work experience as a teacher, and the two women developed a very special relationship and respect for one another. Gertruda helped Lydia raise Michael. She taught him how to read and write. She took him on walks into museums. She would sing Michael lullabies and sit by his bedside when he was sick. And Michael described Gertruda as just always being by his side. And the two of them cared very deeply for each other. And the family recognized how devoted Gertruda was to Michael and really treated her like another member of the family.
I don't care how many times I see that photo, I smile every time, just the obvious love and affection and connection between the woman and the little boy. It's beautiful. But as with everyone who was living in the city of Warsaw, things changed in a horrific way after September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland in an unprovoked attack and began World War II. Nazi Germany deployed nearly 1.5 million men in this invasion, and they unleashed an unrelenting barrage of bombs across the country. During the siege of Warsaw, the city suffered heavy damage from air attacks and artillery fire, and many thousands of innocent citizens were killed in this initial onslaught. Watching this footage, I'm thinking about the family who we just met, and I'm curious how the German invasion impacted the Stołowickis and Gertruda, who lived with them.
The impact was immediate. Michael's father, Jacob, was in Paris for business when the war broke out and was unable to get back to his family in Poland once the war had begun. Most of the household staff had fled, but Gertruda decided to remain with Lydia and Michael. And the two women decided to escape with Michael to the Lithuanian city of Vilnius, looking for safety. There were thousands of Polish Jews and other refugees who also fled to Vilnius at the time because it was thought then that it would be easier to go abroad from there rather than where they were. And soon after arriving, Lydia, Michael, and Gertruda then moved into a smaller apartment together.
And they had not previously lived in Lithuania. I don't think they had any family there. What was life like for the three of them, the two women and little boy, in wartime Vilna?
The journey to Vilnius was very difficult, and it took a tremendous toll on Lydia, who was already kind of frail in her health. She wasn't really well. The influx of Jews made it very difficult for them to find housing or work, but Gertruda really stepped in to take care of everybody. At the beginning, she washed dishes, she would clean homes, and if people didn't have money to pay her, then they would barter services. So she would be paid with food or firewood. Lydia never fully adjusted to life in Vilnius. It was a big difference for her. She went from living in a large home where all her needs were met to living in a smaller apartment with little food or means. And she also missed her husband terribly and didn't know where he was or how he was, especially once the war began.
I think for us today, in a world with cell phones, immediate texting in our pockets, it's really difficult to appreciate that they could not be in touch, that especially once they had left home, if there was no forwarding address, you couldn't send a letter, you couldn't send a telegram and have any idea where your husband is, where the father of your child is. It just must have been so wrenching for Lydia.
And a lot of people were very isolated with that unknown of what was happening to their family in other cities and other countries.
Yeah, just eat away at you every day. Even though, as you described, Kyra, Vilna was very crowded with refugees when this little family group first arrived, it was relatively safe for them compared to being in Poland, where Jews would have been under direct German occupation. But by June 1940, the Soviet Union occupied the city of Vilnius, and attitudes began to shift. There was anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, anti-Semitic violence surged. It was unpredictable and scary. And Lydia and Michael were now newly vulnerable, along with this uncertainty about where Jacob was at the time. Actually going to pause for a minute. Kyra, I want to welcome viewers that we have and let you know where people are watching from. Thank you for joining us today from Martha's Vineyard, from Carolina Beach and Centerville, Minnesota, from the state of Idaho, and as well as other cities in the U.S. We're really glad to have you with us. Kyra, you had mentioned that Lydia had not been in really good health before, but it deteriorated during this wartime experience. And by April 1941, she was quite seriously ill. Michael was only 5 years old at the time, so a tiny boy. And years later, as an adult, he reflected on this pivotal moment in his life during an interview. Let's listen to Michael describe one of the last conversations that he heard between his nanny and his mother.
פטירתה היא קראה לגרטרודה, שמהרגע הזה אני קורא לה אימא, כן? והיא ביקשה ממנה שתשבע לה, שהיא תציל אותי ותביא אותי לפלסטינה לאחר המלחמה. וגרטרודה נשבעה לאמי שהיא אכן תעשה זאת.
And these were a mother's final wishes on her deathbed. Lydia not only asked Gertruda to protect Michael in the current wartime dangerous circumstances, but also eventually to take him to Palestine to reunite with members of their extended family. And at the time, Palestine was a British-controlled territory. You couldn't just pick up and go there. So these were quite big requests to make. A viewer named Garrett is really finding this story to be resonant. He writes, so sad for his mother's passing and a blessing that his nanny was able to make Michael her son. Absolutely, Garrett. And now we're going to be sharing with you some of the ways that it was an incredible blessing. Kyra, when Gertruda made these promises to Lydia to save Michael, she could not anticipate just how dangerous life would become caring for a little Jewish boy in Vilnius. Tell us what happened soon after Lydia's death.
Just 2 months after Lydia passed away, Nazi Germany took control of Vilnius. They quickly issued anti-Semitic decrees, such as enforcing a curfew on Jewish residents. They also made them wear badges, which identified them on their clothing as Jewish. And these signs were obvious even to Michael, who was so young. He remembered seeing a sign near their apartment in Vilnius threatening to execute anyone caught helping to hide Jews. In July 1941, German killing squads and their Lithuanian helpers killed thousands of Jewish men in mass shootings in the Ponari Forest, which was a few miles outside of Vilnius. And by the end of 1941, they had murdered tens of thousands of Jews from the city in this way, shooting them into open pits. It was incredibly terrifying and horrifying.
it's really unimaginable, the brutality, the feeling that Jews had of being hunted. And this is an atmosphere of life and death on a daily basis. Gertruda is doing everything in her power to keep Michael safe. Once the Germans occupied the city, she really had to step up her efforts. Give us a sense of specifically the kinds of things she did, please.
Gertruda was able to obtain false identity papers and a baptismal certificate for Michael so that he would be protected posing as a Christian child. Her German language skills became absolutely essential and crucial to sustaining them during this time. Gertruda was able to care for their needs by translating documents and petitions on behalf of local people. And speaking the language also helped her protect Michael, because when the Germans would turn up unannounced to conduct surprise searches of their apartment, Gertruda would just tell them that Michael was her son. She never intended to convert Michael to Catholicism, but she brought him to church services at the Ostra Brahma church that she still regularly attended. She even arranged to have Michael serve as an altar boy and sent him to the church-sponsored school in order to give the impression that he was a practicing Catholic. Michael also needed to know how to protect himself when Gertruda wasn't around. She taught him never to undress or shower or go to the bathroom around his classmates so they wouldn't see that he was circumcised and immediately identify him as Jewish. And years later, Michael recalled he was so dedicated to this cover story that he pretended to hate Jews around his classmates, even playing a game with them called Let's Kill the Jews. When it was just the two of them together, though, Gertruda really tried to create as normal a life for them as possible. They would still read together. They played games in their apartment together. They would go on daily walks in Warsaw before the war started. So in Vilna, she continued this habit with Michael, taking him out on walks in the area when it was safe for them to do so.
So she was really his rock. She was a completely stabilizing force for a little vulnerable boy in a time of chaos and danger. I would like to welcome our international viewers who are joining us from Ireland. Welcome to you from Prague in the Czech Republic, from Val du Loire in France, and also from the city of Lublin in Poland. We're really happy that you're with us. A viewer named Amber has written in to say that it was harder to hide boys. And yes, indeed it was, Amber. For people who may not be as familiar with Jewish tradition, it is the custom to circumcise all baby boys when they are 8 years old. And unlike in places like the United States today, where that is really commonplace and the majority of men and boys will have been circumcised. Sorry, what? 8 days. I think I might have said 8 years, 8 days. Unlike here in the United States, where circumcision is the most common practice, in Europe at the time, in Poland and Lithuania, it really was not. And they, of course, then would have been visible as Jews. So Jewish boys were marked physically as Jewish in ways that Jewish girls were not. And so it made hiding them that much more perilous, and they could be open to exposure if they were having this kind of hidden identity. So thank you, Amber, for that. By now, it is early September 1941, and life has become even more dangerous for Jews in Vilnius. The occupying German forces forced them to live into two small walled neighborhoods that were known as ghettos. The Jews living inside were imprisoned there. They were isolated from the outside world. Guards blocked the roads and controlled passage in and out of the ghetto. Overcrowding and waste created unsanitary and very unhealthy conditions. Lice and fleas were an ongoing problem for residents, as well as deliberately created shortages of food and clothing, leading to thousands of people starving, suffering from dangerous illnesses. And authorities also would beat and even murder people in the ghetto. So these were really hellish environments. Michael, though, is not there because he is living nearby, but outside the ghetto. Gertruda, of course, is Catholic woman, so not subject to this kind of persecution. And although Michael is Jewish, he's hiding in plain sight by posing at her son. But Kyra, I heard a story about how their lives came to intersect with those of the ghetto residents at least one time. Tell us about this evening when Gertruda actually risked her life to go inside the ghetto. What happened? Why would she do that?
As you mentioned, their apartment was close to the ghetto, but outside the ghetto. And Gertruda really tried her best to shield Michael from the horrors that were happening on the other sides of the wall. But in December 1941, Michael got very sick with pneumonia. He spiked a very high fever, and he had so much difficulty breathing that he began wheezing. And as a fellow mom, Edna, you understand how perilous that can be when you're worried about your kid, especially when they're sick and helpless. So years later, Gertruda described how reluctant she was to take him to a non-Jewish doctor, because if he did a physical exam, he would probably discover that Michael was Jewish and saw, when he saw that he was circumcised. But Gertruda was desperate for medical help to save this little boy that she cared for so much. So she actually snuck into the ghetto through the sewer system in search of Dr. Berman, who was a Jewish doctor who had taken care of Michael before the war when they were still living in Warsaw. Amazingly, Dr. Berman escaped the ghetto with Gertruda that very night in order to treat Michael. And then Dr. Berman returned the next morning back to his family inside the ghetto without being detected by the German authorities. This doctor risked his life and his family's life in order to provide Michael with this very necessary medical attention that he desperately needed.
What an absolutely daring thing, and some might even say reckless thing for Gertruda to do. And how brave and compassionate of Dr. Berman, who could have very reasonably said, I'm so sorry, but I cannot sneak in and out of the ghetto. That's too big a risk to take. I have my own family. But these two adults put everything on the line to save the life of a sick little boy. So Michael continues to live with Gertruda, posing as her son, until July 1944, when Soviet troops pushed German forces out of Vilnius. But it would be nearly another year until Germany surrendered across Europe and the war would end. Kyra, by this time, we've heard about some of the extraordinary lengths that Gertruda has gone to fulfill the first promise that she made to Michael's mother, to Lydia, to keep her son safe and protect him. Did she follow through on the second deathbed promise, the one to take him to family in British-controlled Palestine?
Absolutely. After the war, Gertruda and Michael first went back to Starograd, which was Gertruda's hometown, and stayed there temporarily. Her family begged her to stay and raise Michael there because, they were offering to help. They could help raise this young child. But Gertruda felt very duty bound to fulfill her second promise to Lydia. So she and Michael moved to the Eschwege displaced persons camp in Germany. And from there, Gertruda worked on finding them passage to Palestine. And they ended up living in this displaced persons camp for 2 years. In July 1947, they were among the 4,500 mostly Jewish immigrants who boarded the Exodus, which was a worn-out passenger ship that attempted to transport them to Palestine, but without permission. The ship was intercepted by British authorities before it even made it there.
After everything they'd been through, I could totally imagine Gertruda saying, I give up. Let's go back to Poland, where I have family, where we have a support system. But did this setback deter her?
Oh, not at all. She was very determined. She was really a remarkable force of nature, but of course, it took time. In 1948, they did make it over successfully. And by that point, the land was no longer controlled by British authorities. It was the state of Israel. And Michael was now 12 years old. Gertruda was able to track down Lydia's relatives in Israel and brought Michael to them. And that family wanted to legally adopt Michael as their own child and even offered to pay for Gertruda's passage back to Poland. But Michael begged Gertruda to stay in Israel, telling her that she was his mother. He didn't want to be apart from her. And so Gertruda ultimately decided to stay and raise Michael in Israel.
A really unusual and, again, self-sacrificing decision for her when she could have gone to what would have been her natural home. But her devotion to Michael was unending. It's just awe-inspiring. A viewer named Mary writes in with similar sentiments, saying, what a caring, loving, and wonderful person, wanting what was best for the child. Truly a brave and unique lady. I know you agree, Kyra.
Absolutely.
So what was this new chapter like? Because it's not as though after enduring so much loss and violence that, it's just a happy ending and you start fresh in a new culture, a place you've never been. What was their life like in Israel?
Well, by this time, Gertruda had learned and then tells Michael that his father had been captured and killed during the war, so he did not survive. Even though Michael had family in Israel, though, Gertruda remained so devoted to Michael and did everything she could to provide and care for him. She once again started cleaning homes so she could, this time doing it so she could pay for Michael's education. She ensured that he was raised to be a very proud Jewish man, even though she herself remained a devout and very practicing Catholic her entire life. Michael lived in Israel for 30 years until he eventually immigrated to the United States. And Gertruda remained in Israel until she passed away in 1995. While she was alive, Michael spoke to Gertruda weekly and visited her often. And he lovingly called her Mamusha, which I think is just so sweet. You can hear that at the testimony at the beginning of this episode. And Gertruda also visited Michael in the United States, and the two remained close until the end of her life. And she was always immensely proud to call Michael her son.
Just again, another gorgeous image, bookend it with the two of them embracing, decades earlier. The love is amazing. Louise writes in to say, what a wonderful woman, and little Michael was a very lucky boy. Gertruda wasn't just a nanny. She was a good and loyal friend to Lydia and a wonderful mother to Michael. And a viewer named Jack says, Lydia was a true mensch. That means a good person, a person of good character and kindness, and a hero of the Jewish people, asking for nothing in return. Kyra, I want to thank you so much for sharing this inspiring story with us. It's a reminder of why you and I do this work.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
History is so much more than just documents or powerful elected leaders making decisions. It's about real people's lives and their bonds, and the people who are true to each other and the people who betray their promises. Michael and his parents were among 3.3 million Jews living in Poland before the war, and 90% of them would be dead by 1945. But Michael was so fortunate, thanks entirely to Gertruda's love, courage, and devotion. In recognition of her sacrifice, Yad Vashem, the Israel Holocaust Memorial, recognized Gertruda Babilińska in 1963 as one of the righteous among the nations, an honor bestowed upon non-Jewish people who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Gertruda attended the ceremony where a tree was planted in her honor. It is still there as an enduring testament to Gertruda and the promises that she kept at great risk and great cost. And I know we have viewers watching from Israel. If you are in Jerusalem, or any of you who are watching and go to visit, you can go to Yad Vashem and see the tree that continues to grow, and it's an enduring, visible manifestation, physical manifestation of Gertruda's love and devotion. May we all be inspired by her sacrifices and be thankful for people like Gertruda, who saved precious lives during a time of such darkness. Thank you so much for joining us today. Bye-bye.